The wind that night carried more than dust. It carried a kind of loneliness that even the coyotes refused to echo. The sky was a wash of deep bruised violet, and the last light of day had settled behind the hills like a candle smothered under glass. At the edge of that empty prairie stood a cabin, one window dimly lit, one heart quietly burning. Inside sat Makya, a cowboy whose silence had become his closest friend. He leaned over a small table, cards untouched, a half bottle of whiskey glinting in the low flame. There were grooves in his hands from rope and regret, and the years had carved him down to what the land required, steady, strong, and unyielding. He did not expect company. He never did any more. Then came the knock, 3 measured taps, small but sure. He froze, glass halfway to his lips. For a moment he thought it was the wind playing tricks, but there it was again, deliberate, human, strange. Curiosity rippled through him like a horse scenting rain. He rose, boots creaking across the wood floor, and opened the door. There she stood, framed by the dying light, a young woman, 22 at most, her hair dark as the earth after storm, her eyes holding both defiance and fear. She carried a small bundle and the dust of many miles. "I was told you need a cook," she said, voice low but firm. The words fell between them like an offering and a plea. Makya studied her for a heartbeat too long. The wind tugged at her shawl, she didn't flinch. He could see the road written on her face, fatigue, hunger, but also something else, a quiet will that didn't beg for pity. He stepped aside and said, "You can come in." The cabin's warmth wrapped around her as she entered, though the fire was small. She glanced around, rough furniture, a cot, a saddle propped against the wall, shelves lined with jars that hadn't been opened in months. Everything smelled faintly of smoke and solitude. "You live alone?" she asked. He nodded. "Been that way a while." She didn't press. She set her bundle on the table and, with movements practiced from hard days, began to untie it. Flour, a tin of lard, some onions, and a small carving knife worn thin from use. "If you've got water and salt," she said, "I can make supper." Makya hesitated, watching her hands. They were delicate, yes, but not soft. These were hands that had known work, maybe loss. He filled the pot with water and passed it over without another word. The sound of boiling filled the silence soon after. When the scent of stew began to rise, something inside him loosened. He hadn't realized how long it had been since the air carried anything other than dust and smoke. She hummed under her breath as she stirred, a tune with no words but full of ache. It reached something in him he thought was long buried. He asked her name only when the bowls were full. "Nijoni," she said quietly, eyes not meeting his. "Means beautiful, though I don't much believe in names." "It suits you," he murmured before he could stop himself. She glanced up then, startled but not displeased. They ate in silence after that, but it was a gentler silence than before. When the fire burned low, he showed her the spare cot by the window. The moonlight painted her in silver as she lay down, her face softened by exhaustion. He lay awake long after, listening to the sound of her breathing, wondering what road had brought her to his door. He almost asked, but some things in this world unfold only when they're ready. Morning found him outside, mending a fence that no longer needed it. The desert stretched endlessly, shimmering under early light. He heard her behind him, barefoot, careful. "You've got quiet cattle," she said, trying to sound light. "They listen better than folks," he replied, and she laughed, a small sound like water touching stone. Days folded into a rhythm. She cooked, cleaned, tended to the small garden behind the house. He rode into the fields, fixed what needed fixing. They spoke little, but their silence began to change shape, from cautious to comfortable. He found himself watching her more often, how she braided her hair before work, how her eyes followed the clouds as if measuring their distance from freedom. The townsfolk noticed, of course. Whispered things when Makya rode in for supplies. A woman living alone with a cowboy, out here that sort of thing grew faster than prairie fire. "You best be careful," said the storekeeper once, eyes darting toward the church across the street. "They don't take kindly to sin dressed up as charity." Makya said nothing, only paid his dues and left. But the words clung to him like burrs on his coat. That night, he saw the same hurt flicker across Nijoni's face when she caught the way he hesitated at the door before entering. "You heard something," she said simply. "I did. Does it change what you think of me?" He wanted to say no, but truth had a way of sticking in his throat. "It changes what they'll think of us." She turned away then, shoulders tightening. "I've lived long enough being thought of wrongly. It doesn't scare me anymore." Her voice trembled, but her spine stayed straight. Shame and resilience twisted together in her posture, a fragile kind of pride. He felt something stir, Respect, admiration, maybe something deeper, though he wasn't ready to name it. Later he found her behind the barn, head bowed, hands clasped in the dirt. It wasn't prayer exactly, but it carried the same ache. "I didn't come here to be pitied," she whispered when she saw him. "I don't pity you." "Then what do you see?" He looked at her, really looked, at the weariness around her eyes, the steadiness of her jaw. "Someone who's braver than I'll ever be." She smiled faintly, and for the first time he thought maybe the cabin wasn't cursed with silence anymore. That night, a storm crept over the hills. The sky cracked open, rain slashing against the roof like judgment. The wind howled through the cracks, pulling at the door. He rose to check the horses, but Najoni was already there, soaked through, tying the gates against the wind. "You'll catch your death," he shouted over the thunder. "Then we'll catch it together," she called back, her laugh bright against the storm. They worked side by side until the worst had passed, both dripping and breathless. When the thunder softened, they stood by the stable door, the rain now a whisper around them. Her hair clung to her cheeks, eyes alight with wild defiance. He reached out before he could think, brushing a strand from her face. His hand lingered a moment too long. She didn't pull away. "Why did you really come here, Najoni?" he asked softly. She hesitated, then said, "Because I was running. From a man who thought he owned me. From a life that wasn't mine to live." Makya's jaw tightened. "He hurt you." She shook her head. "Not with his hands. With promises." The words settled heavy between them. He nodded once, as if sealing a vow neither of them had spoken aloud. They went back inside, the storm fading to memory, but something new beginning to breathe between them. Days turned to weeks. She smiled more easily, he laughed more often. The cabin filled with warmth, stew simmering on the fire, the sound of her humming returning. When he brought her a small comb from town, she looked at him as if he'd offered the world. "You didn't have to," she said. "I wanted to." Still shadows lingered. The townsfolk didn't forget. One afternoon he saw 3 riders in the distance, men with straight backs and sharp eyes. They spoke to the sheriff, gestured toward the hills. He knew then that trouble was coming. When they arrived at the cabin, Najoni's face went pale. "They're from back east," she whispered. "He sent them." The leader dismounted, rain dripping from his coat. "We've come for what's his," he said, holding out a folded paper stamped with a seal. "The girl belongs to Mr. Rowan. You harbor her, you hang beside her." Makya stepped forward, calm but cold. "You can ride back the way you came. She's no one's to claim." The man sneered. "That so? You ready to die for her?" "Already did, a long time ago," Makya said, voice low as thunder. His hand hovered near his belt, not on his gun but on the weight of choice itself. But before either could move, Najoni stepped between them. "Enough," she said, her voice trembling yet unbroken. "If I go by my own feet. But no man owns me, not there, not here." The riders exchanged glances. Maybe it was the storm clouds rolling behind her, maybe it was the way she stood, small but burning, but none of them dared move closer. After a long moment, the leader spat into the dirt and swung into his saddle. "You'll regret this," he muttered, and they rode off, swallowed by the horizon. The air that followed was thick and trembling. Makya reached for her and she let him. "You could have run," he whispered. "I'm done running." He nodded, his chest tight with something like pride, something like love. Weeks later the preacher came. Not to condemn this time but to bless. The ceremony was small, held under the twisted oak by the stream. No witnesses but the land itself. She wore a dress of pale linen. He wore the same weathered hat he'd had since boyhood. When the preacher asked if they took each other freely, their voices overlapped in answer. As they stood hand in hand, the wind shifted, gentle, forgiving, carrying the scent of rain and wildflowers. Makya looked into her eyes and said, "You knocked, and I opened a door I thought was closed forever." She smiled, tears bright as dawn. "And I was told you needed a cook," she whispered, "but I think you just needed a reason to live." They kissed then, slow and certain, the prairie around them hushed in reverence. The sun dipped low, painting the world gold. And though the land would always be harsh, that night it felt merciful. The cabin stood no longer as a shelter for one man's sorrow, but as a home built by 2 souls who had weathered every storm and still found warmth in the ashes. Maybe that's how all love begins, not with grand declarations but with a knock at dusk, a shared meal, a silence that becomes something sacred. And perhaps, somewhere out on another empty road, someone else is listening for that same sound, the soft, certain rhythm of hope asking to be let in.